And now I want to introduce a good friend of mine, Dan Zak. Dan and I go all the way back to college. We worked on the Eagle, the student newspaper at American University together, what feels like a million years ago. Since graduation, Dan has been at the Washington Post. He started out as a Metro reporter, but has been in the style section and on the feature side for a really long time. He is now and has always been a totally gorgeous writer, and he I remember let's see, it was, what year was it? Prophets of Oak Ridge.
That's almost 10 years ago. It's like 2013,
Okay.
2013 maybe?
So 10 years ago, Prophets of Oak Ridge was sort of like the Washington Post's answer to Snowfall, which was probably when, did you guys have to study Snowfall in journalism school or anything? Okay. So it was the Post's answer to that. And then he turned it into his first nonfiction book, The Almighty, which I would absolutely recommend reading, although it will make you scared to live in DC, because it is about nuclear weapons. And more recently, he's been working a lot on climate change, and is also someone that the Post has doing a lot of, really in-depth profiles. If you were able to read any of the pieces in Alyssa's email. When I asked all of you, for some DC reporters that you wanted to hear from this year, Dan came up on a number of yours.
Wait, really?
Yep.
That's cool. Thanks.
And Mark isn't back here, but to the point of, kind of writing enterprise features, kind of more in-depth things. That's something that Dan can speak to us all about. So, without further ado, Dan Zak.
Thanks, Anne. Hi, everyone. I hope you don't mind that I'm sitting. I'm not like a lecturer, or I don't pace. I don't know. Do you guys care that I'm sitting? Is that cool? All right, thanks. Thank you for having me. I reacted with surprise when Anne said some of you suggested me, because I feel like no one reads me. I don't do the type of journalism that is the most read story on a particular day, or is sort of widely shared or anything like that. But I do think that there is something in I was taking a look at the schedule today, and by the way, it's like I was telling Anne, I wish I had made it for the session on burnout. And if anyone has any tips on what to do with that, please let me know. But the use of the word compelling, like compelling stories, no matter what your beat, or compelling narratives, like I do think, I know actually for as few people as read my stuff, they spend a lot of time with it. Like the engagement is high. Like I can see that in the numbers, and that's sort of reassuring to me. And I have some thoughts about sort of what I do to try and make stories compelling. But I should say, like it's, if I were speaking to a bunch of students, I would have like maybe a list of things I would advice I would give you. But since you guys are professionals, I'm sort of more interested in just talking shop and answering questions you have. But I did make some notes about sort of how I think about the journalism that I do, and please do not take it as like a how-to or like as instruction, because what works for me may not work for you. So as Anne said, I've been at the Post since I got out of college. I was an intern, a summer intern, which we still do. We still do summer internships. And then they hired me on to work in the Metro section of the Post. So, as a 21-year-old, I was doing, writing about zoning commission meetings and traffic fatalities and all that kind of Metro desk stuff. Eventually found my way back to the style section, which these days I'm not actually sure if people know what the style section is. It is like a vestige of print at this point. And as I have to constantly tell out-of-town readers, style does not mean fashion. It could mean fashion, but the style section was a part of the paper that was conceived by Ben Bradley in like 1968, 1969 as a showcase for sort of new journalism. Style sort of meant a style of writing. It was a place in the paper for sort of more writerly profiles and narratives and features, something with a little, I hate to use the word edge, but sort of more edgy voiced stuff without sacrificing the kind of serious reporting that goes into any sort of Washington Post story. Anyway, that's where I've sort of made my home for the past 15 or 16 years in the style section, and I'm what they call, or what they used to call, a general assignment reporter, which is sort of an endangered position these days. I think people generally are on a beat or have a high degree of specialty in journalism, and I'm sort of a holdover from the last gasp of like truly sort of utilitarian, any topic, any length, any tone type thing. And so, while I've become an expert in nothing, but I've sort of tried everything, every type of story and every type of situation and any type of deadline. And that's what I really like about the job, is the variety. So, just this past year, I went to Glasgow to cover the climate conference a year ago. I profiled Lorne Michaels, the creator of SNL, and Anthony Fauci earlier this year. I wrote about lawns, just the concept of lawns. And I just covered the state dinner last week. It's just like sort of everything under the sun, which is really great. So while I can't speak to like owning a beat, I feel like I can speak to sort of flexibility and quick studying and sort of trying to prove that you do not need to be an expert to write expertly about something. Anyway, so that's sort of my biographical story. I just wanted to say one word about sort of the word compelling again. The way I tend to write stories is, when appropriate, I like a story to unfold like you're taking the reader on a journey. Obviously, when you're writing a news story or a front page story or something on Deadline or whatever, you're not gonna like slowly mete out information for the reader. But the type of thing that I do is I like to give the reader a sense that there is going to be sort of a continuum of discovery, that I'm not just gonna tell them everything at the start, that I'm gonna kind of lead them on a path of discovery. And sometimes that mirrors the actual sort of discovery of my own through my reporting. I don't have any secrets to how to keep people reading, but I do think that, especially when you're writing about something complicated, I approach things as sort of a human being who's learning, and not as some sort of reporting automaton who has learned things and then is telling people something. I like to write with a kind of tone of knowingness with the reader, like we're in this together, sort of. I know that sounds kind of woo-woo and mystical, but I do think that's sort of, if there's anything that keeps people maybe reading my stories longer than they should, because they're so long, it's this sort of treating the reader as sort of an equal partner in the unfolding of something complicated. I also like, I think we're all trained and we all practice sort of the conventional like who, what, where, when, why of journalism. I also try to answer with a lot of stories the question, what does it feel like? Or what did something feel like? Or what did it feel like to be around a person? I think a lot of journalism, and this is not a critique of the journalism, but a lot of journalism discounts that part of it. The sort of what it felt like to be somewhere, what it felt like to be around a person. And then another question I always ask is, what does it all mean? Which I'm sure you guys are familiar with, especially if you're concentrating in a complicated beat. A way to sort of make a complex issue digestible is to kind of put it in context and ask, what does it all mean? There was a former editor at the Post who always had sort of the maxim of any story, big or small, is somehow about the meaning of life. And I kind of was raised and educated at the Post thinking that even the smallest story, a story you work on for half a day and file under deadline, is somehow says something larger about life, larger than the person you're writing about, larger than the thing you're writing about, larger than the event you're writing about. The other word that I wanted to address in sort of the topic of, or the title of this session, is narrative. Which is, I think, is a sort of a squishy word in journalism, because any article, even just a straight news story, is a narrative in some way, you could argue. But I also think that life does not necessarily organize itself neatly into narratives. I think life is messy, and there are not obvious beginnings and middles and ends to stories, and that it's okay as a journalist to respect that and even honor that in the writing. Um, I think I don't know. I think there are some journalists who might look at a pile of reporting or something in real life and see the beginning, middle, and the end. That's just not who I am. I think life is more ambient and wayward than that, and maybe that just says more about me than it does the world. Um, and I think the other way to be compelling that I've found is that, like, if the herd's all going one way, I always look the other way. I don't always go the other way, but like I look the other way. And contrarianism is not a philosophy, but it is a device, I think. And I think sometimes you can get the most compelling story or the most compelling angle on a story if you sort of look at where everyone else is headed, be it people, readers, other journalists, take a breath, take a step back, and sort of look askance or look the other way. And I'm happy to talk about examples of that in our discussion. There's just like a couple like practical things I jotted down just as I was thinking about this class. And again, I don't mean this as like instruction because you're all professional working journalists. But this is stuff that I repeat to myself no matter what, still even many years into this profession. And these are going to sound really basic, but these are things I repeat to myself. And one is, if you can go somewhere, go. Always go. Even if it's a story that like you could totally report all on the phone, if you can find a useful or seemingly useful thing to attend or see in person, do it. You might not need it, you might not use it, but sometimes it's the exact thing you need, and you don't know it, whether it's witnessing something or meeting someone that is sort of relevant to your understanding of the story. You probably know this already, but I make a habit of saying to people when I feel it, I don't understand. I don't understand what you're saying. Can you please help me understand this? I think it's easy, especially in Washington, especially when you're surrounded by sources or people who are experts in something. When you're talking to them, even I find myself sort of nodding along when I have totally lost what they're saying. And I have to constantly remind myself to say, can you hold up a second? I don't know what that means. You're using that acronym as if it's common knowledge, and I don't know what that is. So, I kind of try and make a sort of spiritual practice of really being transparent with my ignorance. Can everyone hear me, by the way? Am I projecting? Good. Yes, good. Um, and the other thing I think about is objectivity, because I think that word is used a lot by journalists in classrooms, out, in the profession. And I think that there is no such thing as objectivity. And I try and remind myself of that when I'm trying to write compellingly. I do think there is such a thing as fairness. But even like even a camera, even like a security camera is not objective, right? Because even like a non-sentient camera is only capturing a certain thing, right? And you don't know what's happening outside its bounds. And so I often think about that when I'm writing. Another editor once said, report like a robot, write like a human. And I sometimes think about that too, is that I think if you're striving for a sort of robotic objectivity in the writing, you both take a step away from writing compellingly, and you might be taking a step away from telling the fairest story. So that's it. Those were the things that were in my head as I was thinking about talking and sort of what I do. I am happy I'd like this to be a discussion because I don't have anything prepared beyond that. And so I'm happy to just talk shop about either what I do or what you do or anything like that. Was that helpful? I don't know. Was that helpful? I don't usually do this.
You have your hand up? Oh.
This has been really helpful. So
Oh, good.
thanks for your opening there.
Yeah,
I'm
sure.
Kurt Bain with National Journal. And
Hi.
how do you figure out what stories compel you to go dig your teeth into? I mean, we got a nice sample of your stuff from Ann. It was the 24 hours of the Trump presidency, Dispatch from Iowa, Wilbur Ross profile. How do you decide what story is worth your attention and worth the detail that you put in?
I mean, I guess I'll just address those clips that you guys were sent. Those, I mean, sort of the three profiles that were included there, Wilbur Ross and Josh Hawley and Ginny Thomas. And interestingly enough, those are three profiles where the subjects did not participate. They were write-arounds, as I call them, as people call them. And they all kind of came from the same place, which is sort of this this question, this sort of sort of vague question, but it's like, what is going on with these people? like this sort of like there's something I don't understand that is going on with these people, and it's sort of comic and also infuriating, and like I'd like to untangle the problem of this person, and maybe there is something that I am not understanding or misunderstanding that would help me figure out what is going on with this person. So in those cases, sort of my interest comes from this this feeling that I'm watching some sort of just watching someone behave in ways that I don't understand, and I want to understand what's happening. You know, I can't really articulate what draws me to a certain thing, because as I said, I'm a general assignment reporter, so I'm not focusing on any particular beat. I mean, artifice interests me. People who are obsessed about things interest me. You know, I spent a year in 2019 writing about climate stuff in non-traditional ways. I guess that all falls under the heading of like, I like stories or people that are like a puzzle to solve. Like there's something I want to decode about this person or this thing. And and I can report my way to an answer. And I don't always do that, but I like the sort of sleuthing, puzzle, figuring out aspect of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And just real quick here, speaking of like puzzles and stories coming together, one of the ones that we were also sent was the last 24 hours of the Trump presidency. Can you explain to us how the reporting of that went together? Because you kept zooming in and out to all
Sure.
these different folk and everything. And
Yeah.
I was just curious, the nuts and bolts of how that came together.
Yeah, so that started out as a story of what I would call what it felt like story, which I do a lot of, especially at big moments like that. And it was really just going to start out as sort of what the transfer of power was going to be like after a very violent attempt at stopping the transfer of power. And then I was like, well, maybe I'll just do the final 24 hours. Like I was thinking of gimmicks. Sometimes a structural gimmick can yield an interesting story. And then I started thinking about, like, to use the example of like zigging or zagging when everyone else is zigging. Like everyone, of course, was focused on the inauguration and on Trump. And I started thinking about all the people that Trump had sort of injured in some way over the years, which were a lot of people. And I thought, what if I checked in with people who unwittingly became sort of characters in the drama of Donald Trump? And of course, to them, it's real life. It's not fiction. It's not a TV show. And I thought, I wonder how they will be witnessing or ignoring or absorbing sort of the last 24 hours and the inauguration and all that. And so I reached out to a bunch of them ahead of time and had sort of like longer, deeper conversations about where they're at, what they're going to be doing and all that. And then as the day was unfolding, I was texting with a bunch of them. Are you watching? Where are you watching? What are you feeling? And then I had another phone conversation with some of them after the inauguration just to like check in. So that was how I did it. It was like I had an eye on C-SPAN the entire day, but then I was having every now and then having phone calls, texting with people to get a sense of like how is this cast of characters experiencing this day.
I just wanted to mention for anyone who's had trouble kind of getting your editor to allow you to do enterprise, a profile could be a good way in. Especially, those of you who are reporting from specific.
Hi, Ashley Murray from I'm striking the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. I don't want to represent them in any way.
Gotcha.
Okay, so I hear you when you say like you want to do this like sleuthing and like decode this puzzle, and I feel that that's what I love. I love getting out and talking to people. The act of writing, not so much. So I'm just wondering if how your process flows from like this gathering and like fun, like going on location and figuring things out to then writing. Do you do it piecemeal? Do you like wait till you get everything and then just like have like a 3-day like binge in your pajamas, like writing the story, or like what is your process?
My process is terribly inefficient, involves procrastination and panic, and I do not like writing. I love reporting. Writing is very hard for me, and the way that I've learned to do it over the years is the wrong way. I can tell you how I do it. Please do not emulate me. It's I've come to appreciate the difficulty of this profession. I used to think of it sort of as a very luxurious profession in some ways, and like what an honor to have the professional mandate to be curious and to go out and all that. But it's actually really hard to go to be like a sponge, like a heat-seeking sponge of information, and immerse yourself in people and subjects and whatever, and all of the nuances and complexities and contradictions of the world, and then sit down and what you have to communicate, all of those complexities and nuances and contradictions are words, which are very crude tools. Like words, we have a lot of words, they're very crude. And there's no way to write a sentence or a story, however long it is, that truly captures everything about something. And that is painful to realize with every story. So I wish I could say that I wrote an outline. I don't outline. I'm not saying you shouldn't outline. If you can outline, please make an outline. I learned the wrong way, and this is how I work. And I just sit down and I stare at the computer until something comes to me. It's a stupid way to work. And then when I do write, I am one of those writers that writes a sentence and then revises that sentence and then polishes that sentence and then moves on. And rarely do I know how I'm ending it. Don't do that. It's better if you have an outline, if you have an idea of where the story's going. I just learned the incorrect way, and this is how I do it. So I wish I had sort of encouraging. I guess the only encouragement I can offer is commiseration. I find it hard. It's really hard. It's easier not the more reporting. It's easier when if you're having a really difficult time writing, and it's going on for a long time, that usually indicates that you don't have the reporting. And I think you know when that's the case. Because there's a difference between like artistically being fraught about what you're writing and like just nothing coming to you ever. So I'm always cognizant of that, of like, I know what it feels like when I just artistically am flummoxed, and I know when I'm like, I don't have it yet. I just got to keep reporting. So yeah, I wish I had something practical and useful to say, other than like having worked in kind of newspapers for so long. If you give me a deadline, I'll hit it. Like, if you give me all the time in the world, I'm not turning in anything. So I always prefer when I'm in like a crushing deadline, because then you have no choice. You have to write the thing. So I don't know. I've had my editor, even though the story's been not pegged to anything, it's been more enterprise, I've had my editor say, you need to give me a deadline, a day and a time. Like you need to impose a deadline on me or this is not going to happen. So sometimes that helps. But it's hard. I don't understand people who can just, it's torture. So just respect that about yourself. And I've learned that like this is part of my process. It is part of my process to agonize over the blank page and over word choice and over sentences. And over time, I've learned to respect that and not pathologize it as like a deficiency in myself. It's like no, this is the feeling I get now. The panic is normal. The wordlessness is normal, and you know that you'll always end up actually delivering something. So maybe that's useful. I don't know.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Caitlin with CBS.
Hi.
You said at the beginning of this session you don't need to be an expert to write expertly about something. Can you talk more about that? Because I find that it's very easy to become overwhelmed by what you don't know.
Right. And that's the other awful thing about the profession is the more you report, the more you understand that you don't know. Like as your knowledge widens, the circumference of what you don't know gets bigger too. That's paralyzing to me. I think that, you know, it sort of depends on how much time you have, right? Like, but I've found as someone who has to sort of keep starting from scratch with every story, because I can't like till the terrain of a beat. Like I don't have sources, like I'm always starting fresh, is to just start talking to as many people as possible and asking at the end of each of those interviews, who else should I be talking to? And if you do that enough, you can start to see the boundaries of the terrain you're writing about, because you'll start hearing similar names, right? And sort of corroborating where information lies. And I mean, I was just having this conversation with my editor about the story that I'm working on now, which is like, I feel whenever I get to the point where it's time to write, I have finally reported enough to know which questions to ask, but now it's too late. You know what I mean? Like that's always the sort of the burden of the generalist, is that like you have to do a lot of reporting before you even know the right questions you should be asking. So like that's a phase of the reporting. It's like introducing yourself to the material, learning what questions should I be asking, talking to enough people where you get a sense that these are the most helpful people on a particular topic or beat or issue. And then it's just, I mean, it's just sort of rounds of corroborating. The danger with, I think, writing about a complicated topic for a general audience is that as you take a step towards colloquializing something, you could be taking a step away from accuracy, right? Especially when you're writing about complicated policy or science or whatever. And so then it becomes round after round of sort of corroborating my interpretation of a complicated thing with people who know what they're talking about. So that's sort of how I do it. But then, you know, I'm never totally confident about, you know, I try to be as confident as possible in the time that I'm allowed. But, you know, even still, I know, I just feel like I'm always waiting for someone to say, well, that's the wrong interpretation of that, or that's not the right word for this. Which again, I've learned to realize that's part of being a journalist. I think the moment you are too confident is when you make a mistake. So does that make sense? Okay.
Thanks for doing this. I have two questions, and the first one is, you know, when you're finally sitting down with somebody for an interview, how do you get that person to feel comfortable in that interview when they might be reticent to give up certain information, or even just reveal themselves in a more personal manner than something beyond their talking points? Any tips on how to address that? And then my second question was, are there any fiction writers that you're reading right now that you're,
You said fiction writers?
yeah, any fiction writers that you're, you know, really globbing onto?
In interviews, I mean, again, it depends on the situation and how much time you have with the person, but I'll sort of speak from the experience of actually profiling someone who's participating, and I would have some time with them and I wouldn't be rushed. I I prefer to make it so that the person I'm interviewing does not know the interview has begun. You know what I mean? So I'm not arriving with a notepad and my phone out, and I'm not sitting down and starting with the first question. I am interacting with them as a human being, and all of a sudden, we're in the interview, right? It's like I have in my mind the sort of broader questions I'm interested in, and sometimes I have a written list. But I think one way you put people at ease is, especially people who are not used to interviews. I mean, it's one thing to interview public officials or people who are media savvy, especially if it's a private citizen, if it's someone who's not used to this. It's not only making them feel comfortable that way, but I also, for people who aren't media savvy, one thing that helps is I explain to them my process, the journalism process, sometimes in real time, so they understand sort of how I work and what I'm doing. So it doesn't seem like this sort of interrogation or sort of unfriendly practice. It sort of depends on the person and how the dynamic feels, and reading the person in real time. But I sometimes share things about myself, right? I mean, the one way to make someone feel comfortable and that they can trust you is you trust them, right? I don't want to use the word con, but con game or con man comes from confidence, and it's not getting someone to trust you. It's making sure, or no, it's not. I'm not sure what I'm saying there. What I mean to say is you are giving them your confidence, right? By being vulnerable, by kind of talking about yourself. I don't always do that. I'm not going to do it out of the blue, just like think of something personal to say. But if they are saying something that resonates with me, or I have an example from my own life that feels relevant, I'll sometimes share it because I want them to see me as a human and as a person too, and it also makes them more relaxed or trusting or anything like that. So obviously that's not applicable to all situations, right? But if I'm writing about, I'm trying to think of so I profiled Fauci in January, and and he's got a lot of media experience, right? Exactly. When I arrived at his home, I had about, I don't know, 60 or 90 minutes with him, maybe 90 minutes. So it's a decent amount of time. And at home, it's not like we were in the office. So being at home helps. Of course, it might not help because if it's a private citizen, you're in their home, they might feel, like there's an intruder. But with a public official like Fauci, I didn't even get my phone out to record immediately. I just, I sort of told him my own feelings about like my own pandemic experience, and started sort of talking about myself. And I think he was, I don't know if this is the case, but it seemed like he was sort of relieved not to be on the hot seat right away. And that we started talking about this thing that has consumed the twilight years of his professional life in sort of human terms. Gosh, isn't this all really difficult, right? I actually used that. I had a conversation with Jared Kushner during the Trump administration on the phone, and I had some very pointed questions to ask him. But I started the conversation asking him, like, and this was an off the record conversation. I said, "How are you? How's your family?" And I'm not saying I was doing that to be deceitful, but I think it was just like a humane thing to do. And I think he was sort of caught off guard by it. And he ended up sort of like, he was like, "Thank you for asking." It was, and I feel like I feel like he was a little more comfortable with me than he would have been. But I think that's a long way of saying being a human being can go a long way with people, whether they're media savvy or not. And your second question about fiction writers, I don't read as much fiction as I used to. I can rattle off my favorite writers. Some of them are fiction writers. I think for the longest time, my favorite writer, who did write a lot of fiction but was also a journalist, is Graham Greene. I love Catherine Schultz and Jill Lepore at The New Yorker. I like Wesley Morris, the cultural critic at the Times. I like this guy writes fiction. He's an English sort of satirist called David Lodge. His novels are hilarious. They're mostly satires of academia, which I have no experience in, but they're a joy to read. I can never remember her name because it's difficult to pronounce, so shame on me. But she wrote a few years ago. She wrote My Year of Rest and Relaxation. Otessa. I don't know how to pronounce her last name. Moshe, I think. But she wrote this amazing novel called My Year of Rest and Relaxation pre-pandemic, which ended up being sort of, for me, the key bit of fiction for the pandemic. Has anyone read that book, My Year of Rest and Relaxation? I don't know. It's rare for me to encounter writing where I go back and try and reread sentences because I don't know how she's doing what she's doing. Like, it's sort of wizardry. The other example of that is Madeline Miller, who is sort of famous for Circe and was it Achilles, Song of Achilles? I mean, that writing is in a class of its own. I don't know how she's doing it. But I read far more nonfiction than fiction. I should read more fiction, but I don't. My attention span has been destroyed by the internet age, so books are tough for me. I'm not scared to admit that. So.
I had I guess, two talking shop questions.
Sure.
One was a follow-up on Kirk's about the 24 hours of in between the inaugurations. It felt like faith kind of jumped out there. You were talking to a lot of people about their prayer meetings and their churches, and was that a thing that you had in the back of your head going in? Was it just that's where the reporting?
That's where the reporting was.
Yeah.
I actually didn't really ever think of that. Funny enough, I don't remember thinking that then when I was writing. That this was like a theme that I was trying to reinforce. I just think it happened to be the group. I guess it must have been a subconscious thing, or it just kind of grew out of the people that I happened to call. And yeah. So I guess it must. I don't know. I guess maybe I did it intentionally. I don't know. But yeah, that's an interesting observation. I'd forgotten about that. I think that there is an element of faith in democracy, right? It's like there's an element of faith that's woven through daily life. Like, you have faith that the car in front of you is going to stop at this red light, right? And so I think, any story about anyone or anything could somehow be about faith. But I think certainly at that moment in time, like January 2021 was a crazy month. And I think a lot of people's faith was completely shattered after several years of being tested. And yet we were sort of falling back on this age-old ritual of an inauguration. And, democratic ritual is not so far from any sort of sacrament that happens in church, I think. And so, yeah, I think it was sort of a natural part of trying to feel what that day felt like. And then the assortment of people I called were either directly or indirectly related to capital F faith, like church, the pastor and the woman in her prayer group, and the Bidens at St. Matthew's, I think, or whatever. I mean, also, we were going from a president who, we were going from a president who I think his sort of faith journey was unclear to a very Catholic president too. And so I think that was in my mind. I was also raised Catholic, so that sometimes seeps into my thinking of things as well.
I know the feeling, but so I have another. So I work for the Kansas City Star, so I was going to ask you about the Josh Hawley thing. But before that, you seem to be. Is this the puzzle thing, or is it because you seem to be thinking about all of this stuff at a really grand kind of macro scale? Is that just the way you've always thought? Is it something that you trained yourself to do?
I think there's probably something constitutional in me that has to do with that, but I think it was also the environment in which I was like raised professionally, like starting in a particular department at the Washington Post that always valued that kind of big picture thinking, like granular detail and vividness, always with an eye toward the whole as well. And it sort of goes back to the sort of corollary of any story, big or small, is somehow about the meaning of life. The meaning of life through a certain person or a certain event or a certain topic. There's always something broader to say about a specific thing. So I think it's a function of both nature and nurture for me. And also, like, I find the world to be beautiful and all those things, but very disorienting and complicated and difficult to understand. And particularly Washington too, where so many people are subject matter experts, but to the average person, the sort of strange habits and knowledge bases and behavior of people in official Washington is baffling in some cases. And so I'm always looking to just understand things. And sometimes, or oftentimes, that involves making connections between things that paint a bigger picture that is bigger but somehow simpler to understand in a way. So I don't know where that comes from. I definitely was nurtured by just the people that I worked with starting at, when I was 21.
And so sorry to hog the microphone,
It's okay.
but the Josh Hawley one in particular, given the fact that I follow him around for a living, do you feel like you, by the end, that you had solved the puzzle, that you understood him, and what was your process for kind of diving into somebody like that?
I don't know that I don't think the puzzles ultimately are solvable in a way, right? I think you can make a kind of good faith attempt at it, or it kind of observing and communicating part of it. That was a difficult story because that I reported and wrote in 5 days, like 5 days. The insurrection happened, and the editors were like, Josh Hawley by Saturday. So I essentially reported around the clock just from my apartment, because this was still, like, we weren't traveling at all. This was still sort of serious pandemic times. So it was entirely phone reporting. And because I had limited time, I couldn't take too long to ponder things. But in my initial conversations with people who knew Josh well, the senator well, and people who were just observers or critics, there was a refrain that people kept saying, which was, Josh knows better. Josh knows better. People who were friends with him said, Josh knows better. His mentor said, Josh, unprompted by me. His mentor said, Josh knows better. Claire McCaskill, his opponent, says, Josh knows better. That was enough for me to say, okay, there's the thing that I'm going to sort of think about with this. And I just sort of went from there. And because it was such a limited amount of time, was that story kind of, am I happy with the story? Yes, I'm happy with the story. Did it unwind the puzzle of Josh Hawley? I don't know. He didn't participate. But I do feel like I talked to enough people through all parts of his life to create a basic composite sketch of someone and who they were and who they appear to be now and where they appear to be going. I don't know if you have thoughts about the story or specific questions. Maybe I can.
I was just kind of curious whether, because like you always, like, I don't know, when you're profiling someone, you always feel like you're missing something. That's what you talked about, right? And I still don't know that I figured out Josh Hawley. I'm still trying to figure out Josh Hawley, and that's why I was curious.
That's another terrible part of the profession is like, you always feel like you're missing the thing, and you can drive yourself mad thinking you're missing the thing. And at a certain point, based on how much time you have and whatever, you just have to sit with yourself, or I sit with myself and say, do you feel like you have it? You have it as best you can. Do you feel like you have it? And hopefully at some point the answer is yes. But I never feel like I have it exactly right. And I envy people who do. But as I said before, I feel like if you are constantly thinking that, oh, I got this, that's when you make a mistake.
Hi,
Hi.
I'm Candace.
Hi.
I work for the 19th. I wanted to ask because you said that the general assignment reporter is kind of a dying thing. I'm curious, like, what do you see as the benefits to that lack of specialty, and not in a way that's like critical of people who are on beats, because obviously I think that's a really valuable thing. But do you see a benefit to being a general assignment reporter?
I do. I mean, apart from personally enjoying the variety, I do think there are many subjects, topics, whatever, that benefit from fresh eyes. I think that, and I don't mean this as a judgment on beat reporters, but I think sometimes beat reporters can get too fluent, or not comfortable, but like too used to the way things are done and said. And sometimes someone who comes in and is like, wait, what? Is it like is like a good thing to have sometimes. I mean, to use an example, in 2019, President Trump was doing, as he always did, like a lot of rallies. And I remember reading sort of political coverage of these rallies, like, and I don't mean to disparage White House reporters, but I would read White House reportage of his rallies, and I would be watching them on C-SPAN, and I'd be like, this sort of beat reporting is not capturing what I'm like seeing and hearing and sensing. And so I said to my editor, let me go to the next one. I want to go to the next one. And it was in Cincinnati, and I did not register with the White House. I, got a public ticket like everyone else, and I went as a person in the crowd and like walking around and all that. I was not in the pen with all of the White House reporters. And I think there was a benefit in me going to, this was my first rally in a long time, to like coming in and like experiencing it and experiencing everyone around me, and sort of carrying with me this like, holy shit, this is a strange and aberrant experience that I think by virtue of beat reporting has kind of turned almost routine. And please don't think I'm disparaging political reporters or White House reporters, but I do think that there is a benefit to fresh eyes, because especially in Washington, things are done a certain way for a long time and people get used to it, whether it's officials or reporters. And sometimes it takes, I think, a fresh, ignorant face to come in and be like, what is going on? Wait, what is this? So that's how I would answer that.
Sophia, I think you had your hand up.
Yes. I would like to talk about the Ginny Thomas profile and how you decided who to talk to. Like, she is famously this, like, to your point, like, what is going on with her? And you managed to find like both archives of writing from like decades ago, as well as her friends. You got them to talk. Like, what was did you have a timeline of her? Because you did that piece chronologically, and John McPhee, I don't know if your thoughts on John McPhee, but he famously has deferred to chronology as his structure for his writing. At least in that piece, you seem to do the same. So can you talk about the reporting?
Sure. Yeah, as you said, that sort of came, and this was like before. I'm sort of proud of being sort of on Ginny Thomas before. Like, this was I think the story was like 2018. And I just remember like seeing her Facebook and being like, what? Again, like, what is, I think that line is in the story, like, what is going on with Ginny Thomas? And I guess I never thought about it as a chronology, like, I never was intentional about, I think chronology is sort of just the natural way to go about something. Although, I think with most of my stories, you will see like the first section is always sort of in the moment or expositional, or sort of like, and then the second section is always a step back, either in time or sort of above the subject. So I think that was just sort of a natural thing. I think, we live life chronologically, so it makes sense to tell the story of a life chronologically some of the time. Well, okay. So first of all, you mentioned like archival stuff. Like my favorite thing to do is to go back in the archives and like just read everything, especially when it's someone who's like sort of a public figure, like Ginny Thomas, is to like do a archive, like one day of just like sifting through ProQuest and old articles and Nexus and because I want to know what's been written and uncovered, and I know that I can incorporate some of that stuff to supplement my reporting. In terms of finding her friends, I mean, I'd have to go back on my notes because this is 4 years ago now, but it's people leading me to people, right? Like people saying, "Oh, you should go call this person, call that person," and like there'll be a chain of people that lead me to finally to the person that well, she spoke on background, and I forget her name anyway, but it's it finally led me to this woman, this friend of Ginny Thomas's, who kind of gave me sort of the money quote, the sort of thing that got me as sort of close to solving the puzzle of Ginny Thomas as I could, which is like, oh, our friend Barbara Olson, when she died on 9/11 in this terrible terrorist attack, Ginny was like, well, who's our Barbara Olson now? Who's going to be sticking up for the country? Who's going to be on TV or who's going to be kind of public in a way and talking about sort of the fate of the country and all that. So that was just people leading me to people. Like my last question for anyone I'm talking to is usually like, who else should I talk to? And that's what sometimes can lead you to the exact right person. Does that answer all your questions? Or yes. Okay. Thanks. That was a hard one.
I have like a million things I want to ask you, but but I guess going back to Ryan's question, sort of, what is your reading diet and how has it changed over time since you were like younger, like since you first started reading to now?
So I
Tell me,
no,
Doctor, tell me how your apartment is organized. Are you messy? Are you?
That's a great question. I used to be a voracious reader. I think in my preteens and teens, I was reading a lot of mass market fiction. I was reading John Grisham and Stephen King and Michael Crichton. I love Michael Crichton. And like one of my favorite writers back then was Agatha Christie. I loved Agatha Christie works. I mean, I don't know, draw your connection between Agatha Christie, like being a 12-year-old who loves Agatha Christie and treating everything like a puzzle. Like, there you go. But then I think I think when I started to actually like do journalism, like fiction sort of went away. And I wish it didn't go away so much. And it's like I read almost exclusively nonfiction at this point. So I hate to say, but my reading habits and diet have really deteriorated over the years. I feel like my brain has been ruined by social media, by the internet, by kind of the life of the infinite scroll and the infinite swipe. And I really like reading is something that I find I have to be incredibly disciplined about. It's not something I just do. And I hate that. So these days, I mean, I subscribe to a lot of things. I try and be sort of weirdly religious about getting through the New Yorker, just because I'm fascinated by it as an institution and how they put things together and even how it's edited and how like who can sound, I don't know, it's just a fun thing to sort of read and sort of intuit sort of what the sensibility and office environment is and the editing, all of that. Although I've learned to give their longer features 4 pages, and if I'm not hooked by page 4, I'm not going to read the ensuing 16 pages. I love New York Magazine. I love New York. I always have. I get the Sunday Times. I read the Washington Post. I subscribe to the Atlantic. Subscribe to the LA Times, the Alaska paper, the Arizona paper, and I don't know. I read a lot of news. I read a lot of archival stuff, depending on what I'm reporting on. There's nothing more I love than like finding a relevant, newspaper story from 1960 about something that's, So what book am I reading now? I'm reading, to bring up Catherine Schultz again from The New Yorker. She wrote a book called Lost and Found, which is sort of a memoir. Reading that now, or trying to read it, because it takes discipline. Yeah. So I used to be a really good reader. I'm not such a good reader anymore. I find that like during a day job that's spent entirely with words, whether reading or writing them, when I finish, I'm not one of those journalists or writers who can then go work on his novel. I'm like, I don't want to see words. I want to watch White Lotus. I don't talk to, like, I just want to zone out. So I have colleagues who like, when they're off the clock, write their next novel or whatever. It's like, I'd like to take a break. So.
Just to follow up on your social media constant scrolling, swiping comment, how have you evolved, like your relationship to social media?
I've devolved.
How do you deal with it? Do you see a difference like through the years?
In terms of in me, or in terms of like social media? Oh. I mean, I sort of, even before Elon Musk bought Twitter, I'd like taken a step back from it. I used to tweet fairly regularly. I used to be on Twitter all the time. And I just think it's, it's unfortunate because Twitter is how I let people know that I've written something, because my stuff is not often on the homepage. It's not often, I just don't do that kind of stuff. And so I feel like I have to be my own hype man for the things. So, so it's been useful for that, I guess, but I think it just inspires the worst instincts in people. Obviously, social media is incredibly important and sometimes life-saving for people who are in less privileged situations than I am. But as someone who is a sort of working journalist in Washington, D.C., I feel like I mean, it's a good reporting tool. You can find people, you can reach people that way, but like, I don't like what it's turned my brain into and a lot of other people's brains into, which is searching for the flaw immediately and then attacking. I mentioned words are crude and clumsy tools. Well, when you only have so many characters, like that's even cruder. It's even clumsier. So I don't like that aspect of it. And I was working on a story about the weird recount in Maricopa County last year in Arizona, which is a terrifying story to report on, but like I got a very firsthand seat to how social media infects people's brains and allows for the flourishing of conspiracy theory into mass delusion. So yeah, what it's done to me, I don't know, it's made me a worse reader. And I've tried to step back from it a bit, but I sort of need it to let people know I've written something. It's a terrible bind. I don't like it.
Final question?
Hi.
Hi.
I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you structure your day as more of a long form features writer. I've always been in jobs where I have like daily tasks, and I find sometimes I think I'm like dependent on those daily tasks, and the enterprise I do is always very much in the background and not like my primary task.
Yeah.
And would love for that to change as I like grow and like get older, and I don't want to be like doing my like daily subscriber stuff forever.
Right.
But I sometimes find during like congressional recess when I'm like, oh, it's enterprise time, and I'm like staring down the entire day, and I'm like, oh, it's just, I don't know. I find that more of a challenge. So I'm curious, are you like working on a bunch of stories at one time and just scheduling a bunch of calls? Like, how does that sort of look? What does that literally look like?
It doesn't look pretty. I wish I could tell you that I had like a to-do list every day and I structured and I was like very disciplined about the structure of an otherwise amorphous day. I do that when I'm under pressure, but again, if like, as you said, if you're on break or whatever and you have like more time than you need, suddenly it's easy to do nothing. So I mean, I do think it's helpful to schedule calls, because then you're accountable to an external thing, right? That helps for me. If I'm accountable only to myself, then I'm like not really doing anything. If I have like a 2 p.m. call with someone, well, I have to first show up for the 2 p.m. call, but then I have to make sure I'm prepared for it and all of that. I mean, it's nothing more complicated than like to-do lists and trying to get some, I mean, either if it works for you, set deadlines for yourself, but that doesn't work for me. So to get my editor to like set deadlines for me, that helps. But it's nothing more complicated than that. I have far more diligent colleagues who could probably tell you exactly what works for them, but I just learned the wrong way. Like I procrastinate, I noodle around, I panic, and then, but yeah, if I have, a lot of my days are sort of up to me. And at the end of the day, I don't always do this, but I aspire to do this every day. I try and leave myself a couple notes to do so that when I wake up and I sit down, I'm not just like, my mind isn't just like, okay, what now? I at least have like this sort of message from the night before that's like, oh, this is what you're supposed to do. So just do this thing. That sometimes helps. But there's no, I mean, for me, there's no like magic thing that I can like conjure discipline or diligence out of thin air. I wish that was something that could be taught, because I would like someone to teach me.
Parting thoughts or advice?
No, other than, I mean, you guys know what you're doing. I'm happy to answer any questions over email or whatever. You know, I love interacting that way too. So no thoughts other than keep your chin up and keep with it. It's as I said, it's sort of a difficult profession, and right now is a difficult time for a lot of reasons, which I think you guys talked maybe a little bit about last session. So just be kind to yourselves, and it's a hard job, and lean on each other. And I'm happy to answer any questions via email that you have.
One thing Dan and I were saying is, with all the layoffs and stuff happening recently, it was reminding us a little bit of like 2007, like when we were both very new to the field. But there was you know, after a few years there, like it did pick back up. I mean, it could, you know, it could not be terrible forever.
Everything's cyclical, I think. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, just keep at it.
Some hopeful words for you. It won't be terrible forever. All right. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you for having me.